Hi guys, it's Debbie. A while ago in one of my Q&As, I was asked what are some of my favourite books. At the time I gave quite a rushed answer because it was part of a longer video with many more questions, so today I would like to give a more in-depth answer to that topic. The first book I'd like to speak about is a classic, 1984, written by George Orwell. 1984 was written in 1948, a time in which many authors would reflect upon the future and upon what they perceived as the possibility of a dystopian reality. So an unwelcoming, degraded world in which society is suffering, usually at the hands of a dictatorship, and in which happiness is long forgotten. And as a matter of fact, the novel 1984 describes a world which is completely controlled by the Big Brother, a government which tracks everything, spies everything, decides everything, even which words can be used and what is the truth. Individuality no longer exists, humans are just cogs in a larger machine, they aren't even allowed to feel love, while the thought police controls and terminates anything non-conforming. I love 1984 because it's a perfect example of the dystopian fiction trend, which includes other famous works such as A Clockwork Orange, Brave New World, all works which back at the time would envision our time now, envision how the world would be. This type of literature was heavily influenced by the situation of society at the beginning of the 1900s, with two world-changing and disturbing events such as the World Wars, the rapid change in society, the creation of terrifying concepts such as nuclear weapons. Artists saw the frightening decline of society and were afraid of what the world would soon become. And if you notice, many works now are following a similar trend, as we're again living in a world of fear, a world which some describe as a post 9/11 crisis, or as a fear of the power of technology, a world in which we don't look at the future with eagerness, but rather with sad and frightened disillusionment. The next book I'd like to speak about is completely different, and it is Retribution by Gillian Hoffman. Retribution is the very dark story of a young woman who barely survives the attack of a violent rapist. This event scars her both physically and mentally for the rest of her life, although many years later she is trying to create a new way of life, a new lifestyle, with a successful job as an attorney. But the past returns to haunt her while she is working on a string of murders and something unexpected emerges. As you can tell, the plot in this novel is very dark, and I love this story because it's so well developed, so well detailed, with multiple points of view which intertwine with no plot holes, an incredibly accurate depiction of a murder case which on the one hand doesn't fall into the boredom of legal procedures, but on the other hand it never becomes ridiculous and exaggerated just to buy a wow out of us. The author of this book was actually a district attorney herself, so she does know what she's writing about. The next book I'd like to speak about is As God Commands, also known as Crossroads, by Nicola Maniti, one of my favourite writers. As God Commands is the intertwined story of different characters set in an industrialised and definitely not idyllic environment. The characters range from a neo-Nazi violent father and his son, to two pretty and popular high school girls, to another father which is dealing with the loss of his child, to one of their very reserved, very quiet friends. The story is presented, as I was saying, as this huge intertwined, nearly epic situation in which all these very different characters come together with some very, very dark elements, and in general an incredibly detailed insight into the characters' minds. I'm really trying to not reveal anything about the plot to not spoil it, but it really is this gritty story of different people in this grim, harsh, cold, modern environment, and because of a series of facts they all come together with some very grave consequences. That's all I'll say. I've spoken before about Amaniti here on my channel because I love so many of his works, so I definitely recommend As God Commands. As we're speaking about Italian writers, I would quickly like to speak about The Solitude of the Prime Numbers by Paolo Giordano. I say quickly because I've actually uploaded a complete standalone review video about this book. I'll leave that in the description box down below. But in general, The Solitude of Prime Numbers is the story of two people from their childhood right until their adult years, from events which scar them as children and define them for the rest of their lives, to the ambiguous friendship, love relationship which develops from them meeting. And it also has some beautiful mathematical comparisons which give this novel a very unconventional touch. On a cheerful note instead, I would recommend all of the Harry Potter books, and in particular one of my favourite books ever is the 7th and final chapter, which is Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. After years of reading all the previous books in which we met a young magician Harry Potter and we learned about all his endless adventures at Hogwarts. The Deathly Hallows represents the apex of the story, the point in which all the strings are pulled together, in which we perceive the characters as people we know rather than ink printed on paper. The last book includes very mature elements such as the acknowledgement of the unavoidability of death, the power of love, of friendship, evil seen as a real concept compared to the previous books in which the element of magic tended to sugarcoat everything. Another book I would recommend while I'm speaking of the young adventure genre is Ready Player One, which you might have seen as a recent adaptation into a Steven Spielberg film. I'm actually disappointed I only discovered this book a few months before the film was released, as I loved it and I wish I could have read it during my teenage years. Ready Player One is written by Ernest Cline and is set in a future in which the world is completely degraded, polluted, impoverished, and the only way to reach happiness, to escape from this reality, is by accessing the Oasis, a virtual reality in which they can enjoy a completely different lifestyle. The plot really begins when the creator of this reality dies and leaves a huge fortune to whoever manages to complete a mission within the game. So we have our main characters, the heroes, trying to complete the game, while larger corporations within the virtual reality branch are trying to gain complete control over this world. I love Ready Player One because it's a modern adventure for adults and older teens. It has more mature topics, but at the same time it gives us that rush of adventure, of hunting for clues, something as adults we often miss. And it also has dozens and dozens of pop culture references. Then what's next? As we haven't spoken enough about dark, gritty plots, the next books I'd like to speak about are part of a trilogy, more famously known as the Hannibal the Cannibal trilogy, and that is Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs, and Hannibal, all written by Thomas Harris. This trilogy, which I actually now discovered includes a fourth book, Hannibal Rising, is a dark detective crime franchise in which various FBI detectives try to hunt down some very peculiar killers, and they sometimes rely on the help of convicted cannibal killer Hannibal Lecter, who loves to play with the detectives' minds and taunt them. These books and the films on which they're based, which I would totally recommend, are very engaging, both because of the way the investigation is laid out and because of the deep analysis of the human mind they present. They show what it is capable of conceiving and how it is often suffering. Now let's take a moment to talk about some non-fiction books, so stories based on real-life events. And I would like to speak about If This Is a Man, also known as Survival in Auschwitz, written by Primo Levi. Primo Levi was a Jewish scientist who was deported. He was captured by the Nazis and deported into a concentration camp, Auschwitz, in Poland. This book is the story of his journey to the camp, how he was separated from his family, and the time he spent in the camp. I like this book because it is brutally honest. It describes, even in the smallest details, things we often oversee when considering the atrocities of these camps. Levi describes the hardships the prisoners went through, even on a psychological level, the inhuman conditions the prisoners went through. The title of this book, If This Is a Man, actually questions whether the reality the prisoners were living could be considered human. The book describes how the situations the prisoners encountered stripped them of their humanity. There is one point in which Levi describes a situation in which there may be a piece of food in a room, and in that moment there is no compassion, only selfishness, because it was death or survival on a daily basis. Prisoners were deprived of their humanity, a thing we don't often keep into consideration when we speak of the hardships the prisoners went through. And also the book describes how the horrors did not end when the few prisoners that survived were freed, because they were scarred for life. So if you're looking for a more thoughtful read, this could be interesting. This is actually a compulsory reading in most high schools in Italy. The other non-fiction book I would recommend is one I don't think I have here right now, and it is Gomorra by Roberto Saviano. Now this title might be familiar because of the award-winning TV series Gomorra, which is loosely based on the situation which is presented in the book Gomorrah, and it is created also by writer Roberto Saviano. Gomorrah is a hefty, nearly documentary / essay book which uncovers the truth surrounding the mafia in the south of Italy, about how it works, how it affects everyday life, and how it expanded from these small towns to the rest of the world. Because of the truths that are unveiled in the book, the writer has been under police protection for over a decade because of the death threats he received from mafia groups. So I would recommend this book for a deeper insight into the topic of the mafia, and it's not only relative to the south of Italy, it is seen on a bigger scale. So all in all, with some lighter books, with some darker ones, with some realistic works, I hope I managed to give you some inspiration for future reading. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.